Hi all, welcome to my YouTube channel. I hope the Part 1 real-time exam questions for Azure Fundamental exam was helpful to you. And if you haven't checked the Part 1, I have given the link in the description. You can go through it. And this video is continuation to the real-time exam questions for Azure Fundamentals AZ-900 exam. And all the questions that I'm going to discuss in this video is the multiple choice questions. And yeah, let's get started with the first question. On-premise application that sends email notifications automatically based on a rule. You plan to migrate the application to Azure. You need to recommend a serverless computing solution for the application. What should you include in the recommendation? Web app, server image in Azure Marketplace, Logic app, and API app. You can pause the video and test your knowledge. So here in the question, the two important things that we have to make a note is it sends email notifications automatically based on a rule, and second, it's a serverless computing solution. So the answer is Azure Logic Apps. Azure Logic Apps is a serverless workflow orchestration service. It automates the workflows without writing a single line of code, and it helps to schedule, automate, and orchestrate the tasks. It also helps in sending the email notifications for various events that happen in the various systems, on apps and services. So the answer is Logic Apps, and I have given the link, the Azure Docs link in the description, and you can go through it and you can also gain more knowledge about Azure Logic Apps. Moving on to the next question. You plan to deploy a website to Azure. The website will be accessed by the users worldwide and will host large video files. You need to recommend which Azure service must be used to provide the best video playback experience. What should you recommend? An application gateway, an Azure Express Route Circuit, a content delivery network CDN, and Azure Traffic Manager profile. Pause the video and let us check out the answer now. So it's Content Delivery Network CDN. So the main 2 points that you have to make a note is accessed by the users worldwide and hosting large video files. So basically, CDN is a distributed network of servers that can efficiently deliver the web content to the users. So it stores the cached content on edge servers on something called POP, which is point of presence locations that are close to the end users to minimize the latency. So for example, if a Apple launch event is happening in USA and if you are in India and you have to get the video access seamlessly with the minimum latency, then probably they would be using CDN there. Now let's move on to the next question. Your company plans to deploy several million sensors that will upload the data to Azure. You need to identify which Azure resources must be created to support the planned solution. So which two Azure resources should you identify? Azure Data Lake, Azure Queue Storage, Azure File Storage, Azure IoT Hub, Azure Notification Hubs. You can pause the video here. Let's check out the answer. The two important things you have to concentrate here is several million of servers and uploading the data to Azure. So IoT Hub is a central message hub for bidirectional communication between IoT application and its attached devices. So here when we talk about IoT devices, so we are talking about collecting the information from several million sensors. So the first answer would be Azure IoT Hub. And for uploading the data to Azure, we can either use the blob storage or the data lake. And here we have Azure Data Lake. So the answers are Data Lake and IoT Hub. Moving on to the next one, you have an Azure web app. You need to manage the settings of the web app from an iPhone. What are the 2 Azure management tools that you can use? Azure CLI, Azure Portal, Azure Cloud Shell, Windows PowerShell, and Azure Storage Explorer. So pause the video to guess your answer. Yeah. So the Azure Portal is a web-based portal for managing Azure, and the Cloud Shell is a web-based command line for managing Azure, and both of these you can access from iPhone. So the correct answer is Azure Portal and Azure Cloud Shell. So whereas the other options like the CLI and Windows PowerShell, you can access it from Mac OS but not from the iPhone. To the next one, what can you use to automatically send an alert if an administrator stops an Azure virtual machine? Azure Advisor, Azure Service Health, Azure Monitor, and Azure Network Watcher. So B and C can be ruled out, and there might be a confusion between Azure Advisor and Azure Monitor. So let's first see what is an Azure Advisor. So Advisor analyzes your configurations and provides actionable recommendations to help to optimize your Azure resources. So this is not to send any kind of alerts. So Azure Monitor does that sending of the alerts. So Azure Monitor helps you to monitor the health and the availability of the Azure virtual machines. So the answer is Azure Monitor. A team of developers at your company plan to deploy and then remove 50 virtual machines each week. All the virtual machines are configured by using Azure Resource Manager templates. You need to recommend which Azure service will minimize the administrative effort required to deploy and remove the virtual machines. What should you recommend? Azure Reserved Virtual Machine Instances, Azure Dev Test Labs, Azure Virtual Machine Scale Sets, and Microsoft Managed Desktop. You can pause the video before we go to the answer. So here the important point is to deploy and remove 50 virtual machines each week with less administrative efforts. So Azure Dev Test Labs helps to quickly provision the environments, and it has all the necessary tools and software to create the environments, and it efficiently self-manages the virtual machines. So which means you can deploy your virtual machines and auto shutdown or remove the virtual machines with very minimal efforts. So the answer is Azure Dev Test Labs. On to the next one. Your Azure environment contains multiple Azure virtual machines. You need to ensure that a virtual machine named VM1 is accessible from the internet over HTTP. Modify an Azure Traffic Manager profile, modify a network security group, modify a DDoS protection plan, modify an Azure firewall. You can pause the video before we check out the answer. A network security group contains security rules that allow or deny the inbound network traffic to or outbound network traffic from several types of Azure resources. So in the question, we are asked to ensure that a virtual machine named VM1 is accessible from the internet over HTTP. So to achieve this, you need to add a rule to the network security group to allow the connection to the virtual machine on port 80 for HTTP. So the answer is modify a network security group. You plan to provision infrastructure as a service resource in Azure. Which resource is an example of IaaS? Azure Virtual Machine, Azure Web App, Azure SQL Database, Azure Logic App. So pause the video. Yeah. So now let's check out the answer. So it is Azure Virtual Machine. So virtual machine is an example of IaaS. So the other options, which is web app, SQL database and logic app, so these resources are the examples of platform as a service. Your company plans to deploy an artificial intelligence solution in Azure. What should the company use to build, test, and deploy predictive analysis solutions? Azure Logic Apps, Azure Machine Learning Designer, Azure Batch, Azure Cosmos DB. So, Azure Machine Learning Designer lets you to visually connect datasets and modules on an interactive canvas to create machine learning models. So basically, for any kind of predictive analysis solutions, the go-to service is Azure Machine Learning Designer. So the answer is B. So moving on to the next one, you need to configure an Azure solution that meets the following requirements. Secure websites from attacks and generate reports that contain details of attempted attacks. What should you include in the solution? Is it Azure Firewall, Network Security Group, Azure Information Protection, and DDoS Protection? So there might be a confusion between Azure Information Protection and DDoS Protection. So first let's see what is Azure Information Protection. So it's a cloud offering which enables the organizations to discover, classify, and protect the documents and emails by applying labels to the content. So it protects the information, but it does not help in securing your websites from the attacks. So, and when it comes to DDoS, it's actually a distributed denial of service. So these kind of attacks, they try to exhaust the application services and its availability to handle the legitimate requests. So these attacks can be targeted at any endpoint that is publicly reachable through the internet. So these attacks can be secured by using the DDoS protection, and it comes up with like two offerings. One is basic, the other one is standard. So both help in securing your websites from these kind of attacks, but standard has more advantages when compared with basic. So DDoS standard can help you to generate the reports that contains the details of these attempted attacks. So there might be a question as well on like which offering will help you to generate the reports. So in that case you have to choose standard, because basic does not have that feature of generating the reports. Okay, so the correct answer is DDoS protection. You have an Azure environment that contains 10 virtual networks and 100 virtual machines. You need to limit the amount of inbound traffic to all the Azure virtual networks. What should you create? One application security group, or 10 virtual network gateways, 10 Azure Express Route circuits, and 1 Azure firewall. Okay, so pause the video here. So when we are talking about traffic filtering, right? So it can be either using an Azure firewall, or it can be a network security group. So since we don't have a network security group, we can directly go for Azure firewall. Understand when to choose Azure firewall and when to choose network security group. So firewall helps for traffic filtering across Azure multiple subscriptions and virtual networks, whereas network security group can be attached to the subnets and virtual machines. So here we are asked to limit the amount of inbound traffic to all the Azure virtual networks. So it's virtual networks, and that's the reason we are selecting firewall. Next question. Your company plans to automate the deployment of service to Azure. Your manager is concerned that you may expose the administrative credentials during the deployment. You need to recommend an Azure solution that encrypts the administrative credentials during the deployment. What should you include in the recommendation? Azure Key Vault, Azure Information Protection, Azure Security Center, or Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. So let's check out the answer now. So to store the tokens, passwords, certificates, or any other secrets, your go-to service in Azure is Azure Key Vault. So it's a secure store for storing like various types of sensitive information. And the advantage is that all the information that you store in the Key Vault will be encrypted. So the correct answer would be Azure Key Vault. So moving on to the next one. This question requires that you evaluate the underlined text to determine if it is correct. Azure Key Vault is used to store secrets for Azure Active Directory user accounts. No changes needed. Azure Active Directory administrative accounts, personally identifiable information, server applications. So we just discussed in the previous question regarding the Key Vault that it helps to store the secrets or any kind of credentials and tokens. And here the underlined statement states the same thing. So it is used to store the secrets of AD user accounts. So the answer is no changes required. Moving on to the next one. You plan to deploy several Azure virtual machines. You need to control the ports that devices on the internet can use to access the virtual machines. What should you use? Network security group, an Azure Active Directory role, an Azure Active Directory group, and Azure Key Vault. So in our previous discussion, we tried to understand the difference between network security group and Azure firewall. So here we are asked to select the Azure resource which helps to control the port that devices on the internet can use to access the virtual machines. So to provide the network filtering across subscriptions and the virtual networks, it is Azure firewall, whereas for subnets and virtual machines, it is Azure network security group. So the answer is network security group. Next one. Your company has an Azure subscription that contains resources in several regions. A company policy states that administrators must only be allowed to create the additional Azure resources in a region in the country where their office is located. You need to create the Azure resource that must be used to meet the policy requirement. What should you create? A read-only log, a Azure policy, a management group, a reservation. So here the answer is Azure policy. Let's try to understand how it fits here. So an Azure policy is something that evaluates the resources in Azure by comparing the properties of those resources to the business rules. And these rules will be described in a JSON format and which is known as like policy definitions. So here we have some business rules, which is the administrators must only be allowed to create the additional resources in the region of the country where their office is located. So these kind of business rules can be defined in the policy definitions and you can create a Azure policy. So this can be achieved by using the Azure policy. Thanks for watching the video. Do subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends. And I'll provide the supporting links for all the questions in the description section. You can go through it. And also let us know in the comment section how many of these questions you have got in your exam. So it might be useful for the other viewers as well. And all the best for your exam. See you in the next video.